Hello, I'm Cameo George, Executive Producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Joining us this afternoon are author Deborah Blum, culinary historian Sarah Lohman, and our moderator Danielle Bainbridge. They're all here to discuss food safety regulations in the United States. This conversation is inspired by the American Experience film, The Poison Squad, which highlights the tireless efforts of one man to establish U.S. consumer protection laws and ultimately the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. We'll talk about the history of food regulation, what role the government should play in ensuring a safe food supply chain, and what consumers can do to protect themselves. I invite you to write questions for our panelists in the chat box. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, Roxanne E. and Michael J. Zach, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, our home station, GBH Boston, and PBS for their support of this project. Now it's my privilege to introduce our panelists and moderator for this conversation. Deborah Blum is the director of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT and publisher of Undark magazine. She won the Pulitzer Prize for a series on primate research, which she turned into the book, The Monkey Wars. Her other books include The Poisoner's Handbook, Ghost Hunters, Sex on the Brain, and The Poison Squad, the inspiration for our film. She's written for publications including The New York Times, Wired, Mother Jones, and The Guardian. Blum is a past president of the National Association of Science Writers and a lifetime associate of the National Academy of Sciences. Sarah Lohman is a culinary historian and author who focuses on the history of food as a way to access the stories of diverse Americans. Her book, 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, is a #1 bestseller on Amazon. Lohman's work has featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, All Things Considered, CNN, and Gimlet Media. She also appeared in 2 seasons of the Cooking Channel show, Food, Fact, or Fiction. She currently works with institutions around the country to create public programs focused on food. Her current book project, Endangered Eating, Exploring America's Vanishing Cuisine, will be released by W.W. Norton & Co. in 2021. Our moderator, Danielle Bainbridge, is a self-described fun-loving history nerd. She has a PhD in African American Studies and American Studies from Yale University and is a faculty member at Northwestern University in Theater and African American Studies. She is also host of the PBS Digital Studio series, The Origin of Everything. Thank you again for joining, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this special conversation. And welcome to Deborah and Sarah. It's wonderful to be here with you today and to moderate this panel. To begin, I'd like to dig into the history of food regulations as told in the film, The Poison Squad. By the close of the Industrial Revolution, the American food supply was tainted with frauds, fakes, and legions of new and untested chemicals, dangerously threatening the health of consumers. Based on the book by Deborah Blum, who is here with us today, The Poison Squad tells the story of government chemist Dr. Harvey Wiley, who, determined to banish these dangerous substances from dinner tables, took on the powerful food manufacturers and their allies. Wiley embarked upon a series of bold and controversial trials on 12 human subjects who would become known as the Poison Squad. Following Wiley's unusual experiments and tireless advocacy, the film charts the path of the forgotten man who laid the groundwork for US consumer protection laws and ultimately the creation of the FDA. This short film clip provides an overview of Wiley's efforts and motivations.
In 1901, government chemist Harvey A novel approach to raise awareness, human trials.
What Wiley wanted to find out is, if you eat enough of this, will it kill you? It created public awareness for people to begin to question what was in their food. And I think more importantly, question these large corporations.
America was definitely the Wild West for putting all kinds of chemicals into food. It was completely unregulated. Any producer could get away with whatever they wanted.
Before Wiley, there was nobody testing to see whether something was harmful or not.
Wiley became the face of the pure food movement that was sweeping the country, mobilizing legions of activists allied in a fight for basic human rights that came to define the progressive era.
And this man's course in life was to make food safe, making sure that the poorest among us could go to the store and get food that wasn't going to kill them.
Wiley's controversial experiments captivated and even entertained the country, and his volunteers earned the nickname the Poison Squad. Their sacrifice helped lead to the passage of the first consumer protection laws in American history.
The Poison Squad was one of the most influential scientific studies of the 20th century.
Okay, Deborah and Sarah, thank you again for being here today. I'm just going to dive right into questions because I know our audience is really eager to hear about the film and to learn from your expertise on this subject. So looking back, it's clear that Wiley's work was crucially important and time-consuming. But what did it take for him to get us the Pure Food and Drug Act and the current FDA?
Oh, that's such an interesting question because it was such a long fight. It's like from where we sit now, you think, sure, safe food, inspection of food, let's have the government make sure we're actually eating what those boxes say are in them. It seems so logical, but it was decades of work by him to get us to that point. And because I wrote a book about him, I can make him sound like he was a lone wolf on the prairie, stalking this issue. There were a lot of other people who were also coming along trying to make this happen. But he started really looking at the dangers of the US food supply in the 1880s. And it was a solid 20 years of him pushing this issue, investigating foods, exposing frauds, exposing dangerous things, and failing to get Congress to act until 1906. A whole series of events. I think Sarah knows too that this was a dogfight in ways that you wouldn't expect. Well, maybe you would expect today because we tend to, think of the word regulation as such a terrible thing. And this was, this kind of paradigm shifting moment in which for the first time, the federal government says, yes, consumer protection is something we do. Up until that point, there was no ground principle of the government stepping in and protecting consumers in the way that the Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which kind of came in together. Both of those pulled us over this amazing line of, yes, this matters, we're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that, in a way, it's a battle we're still fighting because the principle of what Wiley was doing in terms of trying to get the government to oversee things like the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act required, like truth in advertising, ingredients on packages, truth in packaging as well, creating a list of government perceived adulterants as well. That really goes on this sort of American idea of the individual versus the communal. And a lot of the blowback that he was getting both from corporate interests and politicians was when you were buying food before the 20th century, some people say it was like the Wild West. You didn't know necessarily what you were getting. You were placing trust in the people packaging it because there was no oversight because that was seen as someone's private business and that the government shouldn't be involved in that. We see a big shift in all sectors right around the 20th century because we're asking this bigger question of how much should the government be involved in the daily lives of its citizens? We see that in terms of tenants' rights, whereas before buildings were seen as private property and the government shouldn't be involved. And of course, we see this in a big way in food. But it all comes back to politicians said, small government is the way to go. The government should not be involved in the lives of the individual. And of course, the companies making these products and often making them as cheaply as possible were saying, you should stay out of our business. We're allowed to do this. There's nothing that says otherwise. So it's this much bigger topic that is still very much the center of the conversation around American identity right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating. So just picking up on something that Deborah said, now we assume when we get a product, whether it's, medicine or food, that we'll be able to flip over the back and read the ingredients and know what's inside of it. But this wasn't always the case. And in watching the film, I was both fascinated and shocked, a little horrified in some instances, to learn some of the things that were being put into food at the turn of the century. What were some of these chemicals that were being put into food without consumers' knowledge? And why were they being placed in these products?
So, I went back to when I started doing the research, I had bought into this kind of myth of, the happy, healthy 19th century where everyone's eating farm fresh food and everything's all wonderful and we don't have processed food, which wasn't true. In fact, if you talk to people, Howard Markel, who's a medical historian at the University of Michigan, describes the 19th century as the century of the great American stomachache. Because what people ate, you almost took it for granted that your food was gone sick, right? So among the things, just to give you a worst case example, although there were others, the one that really leapt out at me was formaldehyde, which was a popular preservative for milk in particular. It was used in meat, but it was probably best known as a milk preservative. And in the terms of the 19th century, this makes a lot of sense from a manufacturer point of view. We don't have pasteurization. We don't have refrigeration. Milk is a teeming mess of horrible bacteria. Milk was really dangerous even without formaldehyde because it had so many pathogenic bacteria in it. And after the Civil War, when the synthesis of formaldehyde to use to embalm corpses from the Civil War becomes so popular, the dairy industry basically says, look at this chemical will preserve a rotting corpse. What would it do for our rotting milk? And so they start putting it in milk. I mean, again, from today's perspective, you're like, what? And they don't, of course, call it formaldehyde. They would call it benign things like preservaline, say, right? Mm-hmm. Some lovely formula. And then because there's no regulation, right? There's no requirement to label. You do not have to tell the consumer you put formaldehyde in the milk. There's no standards of how much formaldehyde you can put in the milk. There's no safety testing of formaldehyde. None of that was done in the 19th century. You see, enthusiastic dairymen start to put too much formaldehyde in milk. And across the country, you'll start to see in newspapers embalmed milk scandals, mm-hmm. right? Because the milk is literally poisoning children, in some case killing children, in some case killing hundreds of children. And yet, again, from the pushback, as Sarah correctly mentions, this enormous tension over a government that has just let you be you and let government and let industry do what it wants, right? In the spirit of individual and corporate freedom, this pushback against the idea that the government's now going to tell you what you can put in food was huge and intense. So, formaldehyde, borax, which you see in the grocery store today, it's a popular cleaner, 20-multein borax, copper sulfate, a heavy metal, which was used to green vegetables, right? The list goes on and on. Arsenic was used to color candy, not as much, but certainly in the 19th and less in the early 20th. Lead was used to turn cheddar cheese, which wasn't quite orange enough, a little more orange, right? No one had any restrictions on what they could put in food, and no one had any requirement to label it. And I want to say briefly that the labeling point's important, because that was the first thing Wiley really started pushing for. Can we just tell people what's in this product? If you're going to be having milk 3 or 4 times a day, if you're going to be giving it to sick people, if you're going to be giving it to small children, I'm just using milk as an example. There's a lot of others. Shouldn't they know what kind of cumulative dose they're getting here, right? And he couldn't even move that forward. You see it in these reports on the quality of the food supply he does. And at the end, there's this plaintive little, couldn't we just label this? Which tells you how much resistance there was to this, because it actually was such a new idea today we talk a lot about the informed consumer. To inform the consumer, that was a really new idea too.
And it was through his labeling that he then was able to fight a lot of these battles, because when that legislation did get passed, that you have to have truth in labeling, he would then identify dangerous foods and be able to sort of sue them via their labeling. But also some of the, let's say, additives or food replacements weren't necessarily harmful in themselves. He just believed that you should get inside the package what it says on the outside of the package. And we still see that on our grocery store shelves to this day. I think a really great example is one of the first industries that he sort of investigated en masse back in the 1880s was maple syrup, and found that up to 90% of the products on grocery store shelves labeled real maple syrup were actually corn syrup dyed brown with a little maple flavoring. Now that in itself is not for formaldehyde or copper sulfate. That's not going to kill you. And that is in fact a product that we still consume today. But if you go to the grocery store and pick up a bottle of Mrs. Butterworth, I never noticed this until learning more about Wiley, but it doesn't say it's maple syrup. It says it's a maple flavored corn syrup product. So we get really specific in terms of labeling so that you know what's inside. Now, that being said, growing up, I thought that was maple syrup, and that's what maple syrup was. So companies are still they have to put that on their label, but they can still battle your conception of what your conception and perception of what a food is through their advertising, through their own literature. So even just going down your maple syrup aisle, you can see Wiley's work between what is allowed to be labeled real maple syrup and what has to be called maple flavored corn syrup product.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of this we take for granted now. I also grew up eating Mrs. Buckworth, so I didn't grow up eating real maple syrup, but I thought that was the natural texture and taste of maple syrup until I was much, much older. But I wonder, why was it such a big resistance? What's the resistance to this new true labeling or to having some sort of consumer protection? Why was it considered such a radical idea by Wiley and his contemporaries?
Money and independence. It goes back to the government idea of, we're Americans, we're independent, we're solo, government should stay out of our business. And we see time and time again that industry should not be allowed to regulate themselves. But it's money, because maple flavored corn syrup product is much, much, much less expensive to make than maple syrup, which is a very high-end, expensive product to make. So if the consumer believes that they're getting the real stuff at a much lower price, that's exactly what those companies were going for. And in a way, what modern maple syrup companies are going for, even though they have to label truthfully. So it all comes back to money, which I think is another very American idea. Major corporations like the meat lobby, for example, had lobbyists in Congress. We're striking deals with our public representatives in the same way that we might have the gun lobby today. They had special interest groups in Congress in the late 19th and early 20th century. So a lot of the same political maneuvering that we see here in the 21st century, Wiley was dealing with at the turn of the 20th century. So, if you're wondering what the pushback was, we can look at something like gun regulation and understand the sort of money and power beyond the sale of guns was the same kind of money and power beyond the sale of mislabeled or adulterated food products.
And Sarah's right that, we still see this today, and we see it some in the food industry. Our we have labels. They're a whole lot better than even the first iteration of the labels in the early 20th century, right? But there's still deals, and this was certainly true in Wiley's side, behind the scenes deals between government and industry on some of the information in those labels. So a modern example of that is cellulose. If you buy pre-shredded cheese and you look at the label, it will say cellulose, right? What it doesn't say is wood pulp, because cellulose is wood pulp, right? The industry is not really interested in you thinking, yum, right? Cheddar cheese shreds and wood pulp. That's just what I
Right.
want to put into my pasta tonight. And so they work out a deal with the government to kind of give you the information. So if you actually know what cellulose is, right? And so that was also true back in the day. And the other part of it, and I am not saying that every food manufacturer of the 19th and early 20th century was corrupt, but there were manufacturers that would have been horrified at the idea of labeling their product because their products were so fake. And for instance, really cheap strawberry jam usually didn't have any strawberry in it. It had corn syrup, it had grass seed or Timothy seed. Sometimes it had a few apple shreds or something like that. It was dyed red with a coal tar derivative dye, and that was it. Right.
Yeah, the bread spread is what that product was called. It's one of my favorite, like most horrific 19th century products. And you can correct me in these statistics, but I believe so. Yeah, we're focusing on food fraud, and it wasn't the majority of food industries, even in the 19th century. We're looking at about 10% of food industries, but within certain products, you were seeing fraudulent or adulterated food up to 90%. Like, for example, I mentioned maple syrup, and honey was another big one, and milk was very problematic. But more importantly, you saw a higher instance of fraudulent or adulterated products in foods that were intended for consumption by the poor.
Yes.
So that was, I think, one of the really amazing things behind Wiley's work. He wasn't necessarily doing this for every American. He was putting a special emphasis that on every piece of legislature we create as a governmental body, the needs of the most vulnerable should be considered. And it was the most vulnerable among us, usually the working poor, but often just saying someone who was an immigrant, who was new to this country, or who otherwise didn't have access to information, to the news media. Those are the people that we need to protect, and that we will protect through food regulation.
That's exactly right. Because if you were really wealthy, you might have your own dairy farm, or you had access to fresh meat, and you weren't down in the grocery store buying, shoddy meat scraps and gristle packed in a can and spiffed up with a little borax for your dinner, right? I mean, the rules of food, and I'm not sure that's different today either, favor the people who can afford to buy the really good stuff. And I think he got that from the beginning. His background was poor. His father had been a subsistence farmer to some extent on a small farm in Indiana. He'd been driving cows when he was, almost as soon as he could walk. He grew up with a family that fed itself with what it raised. He put himself through Harvard, eventually. But he certainly got the need of people who didn't have much to be treated fairly, right? I think that was a really important part of what he did.
I mean, there's so much human interest in this story that's really fascinating and really captivating in the work that he was doing. So his ideas were not only, they seem common sense now, but they were somewhat radical for their time. But I want to get into the Poison Squad itself. So who exactly were the Poison Squad? And can you speak to what the radical idea of human testing was to determine the adverse effects of chemicals in the food supply?
I mean, when you look at the Poison Squad, and I always think of it as one of the craziest public health experiments in history, period. You would never be able to do that today, right? You'd have an institutional review board that would lock you forever in a dungeon of your university or government building and say you're not allowed to experiment on your coworkers. So the way Wiley eventually did it, and all of the discussion we're having right now leads us to the point where he's so frustrated and he feels so desperate about making people understand at what risk the food supply is putting them, that he decides for the first time to do an experiment where he just tests these additives on human subjects. And in fact, when I was working on the book and I went out and looked at, what studies had been done on these materials, there's almost nothing, right? That was the other thing, is that, you have to put this into context of the fact that public health research is incredibly new. So it wasn't like he could go out and study the literature. So he did this experiment in which he recruited, in the end, he recruited mostly young government workers. They were young men in their 20s. in that kind of, early 20th century way. He thought of them as sturdy test subjects, right? And less likely to be killed by what he was going to feed them. And the experiment was fairly simple, in which he built a kitchen and a dining room in the basement of the agriculture department. And they had to dine there 3 meals a day. And that was all the food and drink they were supposed to have except for water. And essentially, if you thought of it like this, there would be 2 tables. One table would be young men getting wonderful farm fresh food, free, nothing but the best, no preservatives, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. And the other table would be getting exactly the same food, but they would be swallowing capsules of the additive that he was interested in. And he started with borax. And then for weeks, they would tweak the dose. Do you get sicker if you're on it longer? What are the symptoms? They did blood testing and urine testing and food diaries and what's really interesting about the first of these, he did these for, over 2 years, working his way through different additives, was that he started with borax, the cleaning product, which was very popular, was widely used because he thought it wouldn't make them sick. He wanted to start like in a soft entry, and to his horror, they got really sick, right?
Yeah, and Wiley was incredibly media savvy too. So, where he intended this to be this very practical secret scientific experiment, the press was following, they were just obsessed with it. I think that's why people are still obsessed with it today. And Wiley sort of embraced that because he realized, he's been working with the government and the companies alone. If he has public opinion behind him, that really, really speaks to something. And it's going to take, that is really in the end what creates the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, not just the press created by Wiley's work, but there are a couple other key players that I think we're going to talk about that end up creating sort of this media storm that pushes this regulation through.
That's right. And the media storm and the American public starting to get really ticked off, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's perfect segue. We actually are going to be playing a short clip in a second. So the media also played an important role, as Sarah was saying, and as Deborah was agreeing, in the advancing of Wiley's work. The Poison Squad became celebrities, and the trials are chronicled in newspapers around the country. Further, after 2 decades of sounding alarm bells, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is published, which spurs government and public demand for food legislation. We're going to watch a short clip now from the film that illustrates the impact of Sinclair's work.
On the morning of February 10th, 1906, as Wiley was busily preparing for the coming battle in Congress, the American public awoke to the shocking headlines about a scandal within the meatpacking industry. Newspapers were filled with stomach-churning details of the filthy conditions of Chicago's largest beef companies, as described in a damning new book called The Jungle by novelist Upton Sinclair. Sinclair had spent nearly 2 months working undercover, documenting the inhuman labor practices and unsanitary conditions on factory floors. Stories of rat infestations, widespread contaminated and diseased carcasses, and even of human appendages finding their way into processed meat and onto grocery store shelves.
The Jungle was not written as an argument for safe food legislation. It was written as an argument on behalf of workers' rights, but it had unintended consequences. There were a number of scenes in the novel about rats, getting into the meat and being turned into sausage, about how filthy the conditions were, and Americans were eating a lot of meat.
There were stories of people distracting the inspector who was there to check for tuberculosis in cows, so that cows that they knew were tubercular could just be passed through and end up in the cooling cars.
The book describes mold-covered meat that's washed off in a bath of borax and then goes back into the food supply. The walls are scummy with rotting meat that is dried and blood spattered and germs are growing everywhere.
You have the fresh cuts of meat on down to like the pieces of meat on down to the scraps of the pieces of the spoiled meat. And they're all going into different products and being canned and sold to different populations who are completely ignorant of what is or isn't going into their food.
It was a portrait of an industry run amok, an extremely worrying depiction of America's food supply that transfixed the country. I aimed for the public's heart, Sinclair recalled, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach.
So after watching that clip, I'd like to sort of turn the questions now to the contemporary, because one of the things that really inspired me as I was watching the film was thinking about, well, how well am I informed about how these industries are being regulated today? How much do I know about what's actually in the things on my dinner plate? So to start off these questions, I'd like to say, how are industries like pork and beef regulating themselves or being regulated today? And what's the process look like, and what more should be done in your opinion?
Well,
So
we're doing
go
less.
ahead.
Do you want to talk about some of the rollbacks, Sarah?
Yeah, because I was just reading about this today, and sort of amazingly and depressingly, there was a headline from NBC that said, here are the changes in regulation that is making the beef, poultry, and pork industry look like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And I was like, oh man. So there is a lot of rollbacks in terms of meat regulation that's happening right now this year in 2020. And a lot of them are done under the guise of the pandemic. Unfortunately, meatpacking plants have been hit very hard by COVID because the working conditions are terrible and have gotten progressively worse over the 20th and 21st century. Not worse since Sinclair, but things got better, and now we're sort of heading backwards again. As one journalist said, there are really places that have a complete disregard for the safety of their workers. So overcrowded, unventilated, and it's threatened to create a meat shortage in America. So in order to make up for that, allegedly, the Trump administration has put into place or rolled back a lot of legislation saying, well, this is going to stop a meat shortage. But a lot of it appears to just be sort of kickbacks to people in the meat industry. And the major things are there are now less USDA inspectors in the processing plants, that the inspections are left up to employees who honestly might be undertrained. And there is now no speed limit as to how quickly pork, and I believe now poultry as well, can be processed, meaning that the plant managers can run the line as quickly as possible, it's been proven, but it's also very obvious that that leads to employee injury. And much like Upton describes the same thing happening, the line being pushed as quickly as possible. And not only do some of the main characters get injured when that happens, but carcasses that are diseased just go flying past without any kind of inspection. So those have nothing to do with the pandemic. Those have everything to do with those meat processors squeezing as much money as possible out of every hour their facility is in operation. And it is frightening because they are some of the exact same issues that Upton both described in his book, and then ultimately the public rallied against to create better working conditions. Because it wasn't just about what was happening to the food. His book, The Jungle, was about what it was like to work in these meatpacking plants. And honestly, that experience has changed very little, depressingly.
Yes, and one of the real issues with that is so the two laws that passed together, the Meat Inspection Act, which really was driven by The Jungle, and the Food and Drug Act, which was Wiley's baby, and they come in together, and the Meat Inspection Act, and this is, as Sarah says, one of the things that the Trump administration is undoing, had this one part that gave it a special power, which was that a federal inspector had to approve the meat, or it couldn't be sold. And so if an inspector didn't clear it, the meat could not actually be sold by the factory. And so you will see occasionally these recalls of meat. That's the USDA forcing the meat industry to recall meat because the inspectors have said it's bad. And so this rollback undoes that, because now there's not as many federal inspectors in the factory, and the things can just come out anyways, which I'm not saying this is happening as we speak, but it really raises the risk that bad meat that is contaminated with bacteria can go on through without being stopped by this inspection process. So there's that. The other thing that happened with those two laws is because there was so much outrage over meat. And the Meat Inspection Act kind of pulled Wiley's Food and Drug Act over the crossing line, as it was at last, right? In that sort of wash of fury. But the FDA, or the Food and Drug Act eventually led to the FDA, but the FDA never got the money that the USDA did. Under the Meat Inspection Act, just the way it's set up, the USDA inspects about 10 to 20% of the food supply and gets about $1 billion a year to do it. The FDA inspects 80 to 90% of the food supply and gets $1 billion to do it. Mm-hmm. So therefore, we have this imbalance of power that was actually created in 1906, which means that the FDA inspections are much less frequent and have much less teeth in them than the USDA. And what the Trump administration to some extent is doing now is pulling the USDA backwards toward that less protective net that we see on the FDA side of things.
Mm. And in light of what you guys are saying about the current administration sort of rolling back of protections for these certain industries, do you think that the government still plays a role in protecting us from industry? And if so, what is the government's role in keeping us safe? This is especially probably relevant to our audience this year because we're living through a global health crisis. We're seeing the release of new vaccines. So I'm just wondering exactly where we are with that.
I mean, I don't believe in shoving everything off on the consumer or the recipient. There's no way for us to know everything about food products or drink products or medications or vaccines. We don't have the information at hand that government researchers do. And so the government does have, I think, an absolutely essential job in consumer protection of all these different things, right? We want the vaccines to be safe. We want to be able to trust the food we eat. We want to be able to trust what we drink. We want our medicines not to be contaminated with fungus, as happened recently in a compounding pharmacy scandal. We want the government to stand in between these kinds of problems. And one of the things I always think about the American hostility to regulation is if you just think of regulation as consumer protection, and going back to, Sarah's point about the early regulations really protecting the people who didn't have a lot of money or didn't have a lot of insight into the process. If you just realize that what we're talking about is consumer protection, everyone wants that, right?
Mm-hmm. Because industries, they should not self-regulate. They cannot self-regulate. They need oversight. And that should not fall on consumers' shoulders, because how do we do that? I think that every human and every American has a right to be able to go to the grocery store and buy a can of green beans or a jug of milk and be confident that there's not going to be something harmful within this, and non-debatably harmful, because certainly there are many opinions about what food is good or real, but I know my milk's not going to have formaldehyde and my green beans aren't going to have copper sulfate. They're not going to have things that are going to directly kill me. And Wiley's work has given us that, has given us the trust and the faith that we can go to our grocery stores and we can purchase products that will not harm us or our families. And we should not lose that. That should absolutely stay in place. And I think that's a really basic human right, a right to food and security that we can all agree on too.
And if you doubt that these regulations work, the estimate is that food was one of the top 10 causes of death in the 19th century. We know that's not true today, right? And so this 100 years or so of putting in place protective apparatus, requiring safety testing of additives, we're taking them out as we occasionally do, right? We certainly have removed some toxic food dyes and other things from the food supply. Requiring, just as a very simple example, there's a form of E. coli, which is really lethal. And what you need to do when you're cooking it is to get it to a high enough temperature to kill the bacteria. The government requires the restaurants get the meat to that heat. And before they did that, people died, right? So these things actually work. And that's the other thing to remember, that it puts a safety net underneath us. And when we're giving taxes to the government to protect us, let it protect us in our everyday lives.
And we've been talking a lot about food, but Wiley's Law and, of course, the FDA is also encompassing medicines too,
Yes.
right? I had forgotten about this, but as I was sort of reviewing your book, The Poison Squad, today, Deborah, I had forgotten about the 1937 cough syrup scandal. There was cough syrup that was being sweetened with antifreeze. Again, without a list of adulterants that wasn't necessarily illegal, but over 100 people died, and most of those were children. And that really shocked me because I think of the turn of the century, 19th century as being a really long time ago, but as the 1930s as being a pretty modern era. And so there is also this constant regulation and questioning and relooking at and studying medicine, which, as you mentioned earlier, we want our vaccine to be safe. So, I mean, I think in a certain way, and none of these drug companies putting the vaccine together want to make a mistake because they want to be the drug company that saves the world. That will look very, very good for them. But the whole system of regulations that are in place to test medicines also caught one that wasn't doing very well. The AstraZeneca one shut down about 6 weeks ago or something like that. And it's because there was this strict system in place about how you test medicines. And one of the things that Wiley railed against was patent medicines too, whether it was something completely innocuous like red clay that was being advertised as a cancer cure, or something that was loaded full of opiates or cocaine, that was there to help you solve your women problems or whatever sort of vague idea they might put on the bottle. So we also don't have those fears in medicine, not to say, again, both with medicine and food, that we don't have scares, that there aren't still deaths from medicine or food poisonings. But compared to what was happening before 1906, before there was any regulation, it was the turning point in our confidence in both the food and the medical industries.
And it laid down the foundation for every consumer protection agency that follows. The EPA, OSHA, all of them are laid down on the principles set by these food laws. And the Food and Drug Law that says, yes, the government is in the business of protecting the consumer. And I'm glad you mentioned the 1937 incident with the cough syrup, because the 1906 law wasn't perfect. It had been really watered down by industry. That's one of the reasons, that future scandals happened. And so in 1938, we got the 1938 Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act, which creates the modern FDA. But during the 1930s, there were a lot of people pointing out risks then. And there's a wonderful book. I almost think it should be required reading, like The Jungle, which is called 100 Million Guinea Pigs, which was written by a couple of food and drink and drug crusaders trying to make the food supply safer, in which they make the case that the American population, which was 100 million then, are all guinea pigs for industry as they put these products out on the market. And then we find out if they're safe or not when people get sick. We don't want to be guinea pigs. I think that's the bottom line of all of this. We don't want to be in a system which makes us be the living test animals, the living poison squad members today, right? For the American food supply, we ask that we've moved beyond 1906 or those tests that Wiley ran starting in 1902. And so that we have this protective bulwark between us and that situation. And I actually don't think that's too much to ask. I think we absolutely should ask that.
So I'd like to take a moment now. I don't want to lose track of time, and I'm so riveted by everything you guys are saying, but I wanted to remind our audience that they could send in questions or comments that they'd like us to read, and we'll be answering them on the live stream. So I do have one audience question here already. And this audience member asked, have there been any modern day food scandals as gross or as dangerous as formaldehyde in milk?
There was, the one that leaps out to me was the Peanut Corporation scandal. Do you remember that, Sarah? It was.
I don't.
It was, I want to say, it was the scandal that caused the Obama administration to pass the 2011 FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, in 2011. But what happened was there was a guy who was making industrial peanut butter. He was one of the few CEOs who went to prison. And he was doing all these sort of shady things to get by the inspectors. And the inspectors, I think he had a factory in Georgia and one in Texas, were kind of half-assing their way around the inspections. And so in the peanut butter, lethal mold aflatoxin started to grow. And they're sending out this peanut butter. It goes into those little peanut butter sandwiches you see in, vending machines and snack packs. It went into peanut butter supplies for nursing homes and other places. It was cheap peanut butter. Dozens of people died.
Mm.
And this was actually hunted down by starting out with state epidemiologists. The state epidemiologists actually came against the federal one. And the Peanut Corporation of America scandal actually drove a law in the knee-jerky way we do regulation, right? It was like people looked and said, okay, we're good, but we're not good enough. And so they passed the 2011 Food Safety Modernization Act, which the current administration has not enthusiastically embraced and put into place. But that was the one that really stands out for me because so many people died, right?
Yeah, in about 2008, 2009 in China, there was a huge adulteration scandal in baby formula.
That's
so that
right.
was really tragic in that a company was producing formula that essentially had no nutritive elements to it. I don't remember what it was made out of. It was basically made out of nothing. And so babies in China were dying of malnutrition because they were buying this baby formula and it had no nutritional value to it. And that was happening right around the first time I was learning about swill milk, which is the name for basically the same scandal that happened in New York, Brooklyn, and New York City in the middle of the 19th century, which is too long to go into, but give it a Google if you want to be horrified. That I remember there's also one about last year. There's this fancy restaurant in LA that basically served jam on toast and was known for their jam. You know what I'm talking about, Deborah?
Yes.
It's kind of like,
it was like this huge scandal when you actually, I think employees ratted them out, right?
The employees ratted them out. So it was this very like elevated, like wholesome, everything we make is fresh and beautiful. And so the employees, I don't remember if they were whistleblowers to the press or if they actually went to the FDA and the USDA, but they were like, yeah, we scrape inches of mold off of these vats of jam and are told to serve it. And then the thing to me that was like the most like, oh my God, about it is then the restaurant released a statement saying, well, our jam is all natural and it naturally cures much like charcuterie. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. No, jam doesn't cure like charcuterie. Absolutely not. So we've talked a lot about food production, but obviously these same rules are applying within small food producers and in restaurants too. And they're there for a reason because you went to that fancy, $9 a piece slice of toast LA restaurant. You don't want moldy jam that might literally poison you.
And just to make the point that the system also does work, you reminded me of this with and that was melamine in milk, right? It's that compound that goes into plastics and stuff. But there was also a scandal also originating in China in which they were shipping out toothpaste that was sweetened with antifreeze, diethylene glycol. And it actually killed a lot of kids in Latin America, right? It was cheap toothpaste. Diethylene glycol or antifreeze is really sweet, but the FDA caught it. The FDA inspectors inspecting imported products, and that's their job. They did test it and they did catch it, and there were no deaths in the United States. So the system is leaky. It's not as strong as I want it to be. I resent every day that the current administration has rolled back, what I think of as minimal protections, but it is so much better than what we used to have. And in the old system, that, antifreeze sweet toothpaste would have come here and children would have died, right?
And keep in mind, yes, there's definitely sometimes still scandals, but thalidomide wasn't approved in the United States. The morning sickness drug that ended up causing severe birth defects in Europe and Australia and Japan, it was not approved by the FDA in America.
Right.
So we didn't have those same issues because they looked at it and they said, no, there isn't enough testing, there's enough proof here. So I think sometimes that we get more publicity when there are mistakes made, and that is the way the system should work, right? Wiley wanted us to not have to think and not have to worry about our food and medicine. That was his goal. And in many ways, that's where we are.
So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to take another question from YouTube. It says, I'm curious what the public's confidence is in the FDA. I'm assuming today.
I find, and this is not my personal opinion, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but I often find I mean, it's like both sides. A lot of people think that the FDA isn't being rigorous enough, and almost the same people think they're being too rigorous. The two kind of examples of the polar opposites you might find in a single individual I can think of is monosodium glutamate, which has been proven again and again and again to not be harmful and not have adverse side effects through multiple papers, and is currently generally recognized as safe by the FDA. A lot of people think that by that being allowed in our food, the government is allowing companies to poison us. But then the flip side is people believe it should be your individual choice to drink unpasteurized milk. And, pasteurization is historically one of the largest causes of infant and child mortality in this country. And pasteurization is incredibly important. And there are really no benefits to drink. There's no benefits to drinking raw milk. I can say there's no scientific proof, but also there's just no benefits to drinking raw milk. There's only danger. There is some debate in terms of it's really difficult for small dairies to afford the equipment to pasteurize, but that seems like a different issue. Like, let's get some funding for those small businesses. So on one hand, people might say the government should stay out of my business and let me drink as much raw milk as I want. It shouldn't have to be pasteurized, but also I can't believe they're letting people poison us with monosodium glutamate. So it all just seems to be a case-by-case basis.
I 100% agree with you. Pasteurization is one of the great public health advances of the 20th century, and it saved countless lives. I mean, it's interesting with the FDA. I don't think the FDA took as big a reputation hit as the CDC did during the last year. And although Stephen Hahn, the commissioner of the FDA, wobbled a little, I liked the very deliberate process that we saw with the vaccines. We weren't the first country to rush them in, right? I mean, there was more of a step-by-step process. I gave a talk about this book. I spent a day at the FDA talking about this book, both in one big talk and then with different groups. And I was glad I went, because I can feel hostile to the FDA. They're not always nearly as communicative or transparent as I would wish they would be about some of these things, right? And if you're a working journalist and you're trying to get information from the FDA, they can really be difficult. But being there, for a day, I was reminded of how many people there, they really think what they do is important, and they're working really hard to protect us. And I talked to one of the guys he was a chemist in their big testing laboratory. They were testing tens of thousands of foods every year, right? Looking for additives, looking for fraud, looking for dangerous substances. So I'm glad we have the FDA. I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it's out to get us, right?
Can I jump off something you're saying, Deborah? Because I remember, you talk a lot in your book about that Wiley had this moment where he realized that scientists were talking to other scientists and they weren't good at talking to the general public. Yes. And so Wiley hired a journalist that he would essentially talk to and describe the science to, and then the journalist would write that in a way that the general public understands.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And I think that in America today, that is one of our biggest issues, that people who are in various important fields of science aren't necessarily very good at communicating outside of their community, which is not necessarily part of their job. There's a real need for science journalists and for there to be a greater emphasis on communicating science in a way that every citizen can understand. And if we can do that, there's going to be a lot less fear and sort of resistance of it as well.
Agree, because we're afraid of what we don't understand, mostly, the boogeyman that we don't understand. And I would wish for all of these really smart people who are doing things to protect us, to give us more insight into how the process works and what they're doing, and to work harder to publicize what they're doing. I mean, sometimes when I'm talking to people about things that the FDA has put up guidance statements about the level of arsenic in rice, for instance, and I don't want to go down that alley. They don't even know it's there, right? So the FDA has actually looked at it. They've done studies. There's guidance about the amount, the issues with arsenic in rice, and nobody knows it. And so I think we need more Wileys hiring more science writers at the government level. And the fact that he did that in the 1890s tells you just how forward looking. I mean, he was also a product of his time in some annoying ways, but in many ways, he was so forward looking in thinking about how do we reach the public and how do we create an informed public. And even though I think the government is, stands there, I'm all for an informed public too, right?
So this has been so wonderful, and I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask the final question. These are actually two questions that were related to each other that came into us, so I'm going to ask them together. Has what you've studied about food manufacturing and food regulation informed what you eat? If so, how? And where can people research food additives and labeling?
So, the one thing that it's really done for me is deepen my deep faith in a varied diet, right? A lot of the contaminants that we're talking about today are low dose, very low dose, right? It's like the whole field of low dose toxicology. And a lot of those very tiny doses cycle out of your body in a day or a couple of days, right? So you best protect yourself by eating a varied diet. You're not exposing yourself to the same thing every day, right? You're mixing it up. The whole variety is the spice of life thing is absolutely right. And I use that a lot. I mean, there's a few things that I've gotten, more careful about what I eat, but mostly I just try to mix it up.
Yeah, I think that studying this causes me to ask a lot of questions and consider multiple sides of the issue and multiple definitions, because there is a lot of talk from all different sides coming at you about what good food is and what bad food is, and healthy food and unhealthy and fake and real. And we really have to think about what do those terms mean and to who? What are our cultural connections to food? We have a lot of knee-jerk emotional reactions to food, and especially food science. And I think that going deeper into this just gives me a really level head to consider all different sides of an issue and what good is and what bad is, and also our own sort of morality that's tied into food and how we eat, and how we police the morality of other people through food, especially those who are living in poverty and have limited food choices. And why do they have limited food choices? So I think what it comes down to for me is I don't accept simple answers, and I try and I don't use words like healthy, unhealthy, good, bad, real, fake, because I think that when it comes down to it, those don't have any real meanings. They don't have official definitions. And so I ask a lot of questions and try to find those answers for myself from sources that are fact-based sources.
And you can, I mean, if you go to the FDA website, you can search it by whatever food item you're interested in and see what's there. There's the Center for Science in the Public Interest, does a whole lot of, food safety stuff. The Environmental Working Group does that as well. And one of the simplest things that I do is there is a food safety lawyer, Bill Marler. He publishes a food safety blog. And if you look at the Marler's food safety blog, it lists all the recalls. It'll tell you what food has been recalled. It'll tell you what cases that are really being looked at in a legal way. And it's a real simple way to get a kind of overview of what's going on from a legal perspective.
Yeah, and follow food writers like Harold McGee is a great example. He's a very science-based food writer, and even in his first book on food and cooking, he breaks down a lot of additives and ingredients and what that means. I think that it is important to know what the good sources are, the ones that Deborah mentioned, because coming back to the idea of like MSG, if you just Google monosodium glutamate, the first website that comes up is a really bad website that just sort of villainizes this ingredient with no basis in science fact. And I think that that's a bigger problem too, because you really have to dig a little bit to find the actual papers or who is writing about it and who's talking about it. MSG in itself has been a little bit more broadly written about, particularly in regards to its link to the Asian American community, who are now, first and second generation American becoming chefs. There's a lot more positive and science-based writing around it, but there are a number of ingredients and vaccines and medicines that often the sort of alarmist opinion-based websites are the ones that come to the top of the Google search. So make sure your sources are good ones. Tough in the 21st century.
Excellent advice.
Yeah, excellent advice that I'll definitely be taking on myself. So Thank you both, Deborah, Sarah, for this really enlightening and inspiring conversation about food safety. And I'll throw back to Cameo George for her closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us tonight for this important and timely conversation. The Poison Squad is available to stream in full on americanexperience.org. Our virtual events are recorded and can be watched anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you like what you heard today, please sign up for our new newsletter highlighting our virtual events and other interactive broadcast opportunities. Thank you again, and have a great night.